Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to NobleProg's Cup of Tech series. Today, we're very lucky to be joined by Richard Bell, who's going to be presenting our RPA webinar, Is Process Automation a Real Prospect or Hype? Just to make you aware that this session is going to be recorded and Richard will be happy to take questions. If you do have any questions, please post them in the Q&A section and Richard will answer them at the end of the session. So I'm going to hand over to Richard, who will introduce himself, and we'll get started. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So yeah, I'm going to be talking for the next half hour or so on the topic of automation. And as I asked the question, have we reached peak mouse? We also, or many of us working in offices, we spend a lot of time with these tools, the mouse, the keyboard, and I've been in business for many years. And certainly I've spent more time than I wish to consider. I don't know how many millions of mouse clicks I've made. So question is, will automation, is it going to make a really big difference? Or is this just a hype, or is this something we can really expect to happen? So I started my life working in finance, and at a certain point I moved, having found accountancy much too exciting, moved into procurement in large corporate environment. And for the last 10 years, I have worked on, as an independent, on outsourcing, training, and also then the training fits together really with the analytics side. So I work with tools like R and Tableau and Power BI, and then also on process automation. And these things, as I'll demonstrate later, actually come together. In terms of process automation, I started working with an RPA tool, which is called UiPath. Some of you may be familiar with that. And my thinking evolved, and I'm going to share that with you as I got into process automation of office and administrative activities. And so I started building web applications using programming languages, using Microsoft Azure, using SQL Server databases hosted in the cloud. The first RPA project that I was involved with involved the integration of something called an online reverse auction with an enterprise resource planning system. So what is an online reverse auction, or what is a reverse auction? Think about a normal forward auction. If you're trying to sell a painting as the seller, you're trying to maximize your price, and the buyers are trying to get hold of the painting. So the auctioneer's job is to increase the price. With a reverse auction, which is something that the procurement community typically use, it works the other way around. The buyer is trying to minimize the price. And so the sellers are trying to bid for the business of the buyer by reducing their price. And there are a number of online platforms that are available for this. And I started off working with such a reverse auction system, and that in itself actually automates the process that usually a buyer goes through, or typically a buyer issues some kind of tender document. There's probably some spreadsheets with that document. They will receive responses back. They will put the spreadsheets together. They will issue some kind of bid feedback information. And then once the process is finished, they'll place an order. So the reverse auction itself automates that process of receiving emails, sending emails, collating spreadsheets. But what I asked the provider I was working with to do was to say, how can we automate the process of collecting data from the ERP system? So I need to know, what is it that I want to buy? When am I short of that product? When should I buy the product? And all of the information that comes with it, the specifications, the historic pricing. So I had to manually pull that information originally from the ERP system, run the reverse auction. So that's points 2, 3, and 4. And then at the end of the process, I would then place an order, which again was a manual process initially. So what I did was to then, having come across RPA tools, I integrated the collection of the data, point 1, with, and then setting up the reverse auction, and then feeding it through, and then ultimately placing the order again. That was automated once the event had completed. And I'll take you through some of my observations shortly. But that's how I got started with RPA. So the questions I'm going to be trying to answer the next half hour or so are: the headline question is automation of office processes, of administrative process. Is that real or hype? Which strategy and tools should we be considering? And if you're moving forward on automation, which processes are best suited to automate? Something that's in the headlines a lot, and I think will continue to be, is the security of our information systems. How sustainable are automated routines? And then we'll finish off looking at how will the automation of administrative processes affect our organizations. I remember back in the 80s when I was at school, there was a lot of talk about the automation of car plants. So this automation is not something that is new in business. And if you look at the postal services, the last 15 years or so, also in the past, you would have seen a lot of manual activity going on. But now we've moved on to automated sorting systems. So we've been able to automate processes for quite some time. Typically, those processes have been core activities, and the administrative processes, to some degree, have been left behind. So the question then comes in, why have they been left behind? How significant are our administrative activities as a part of what an organization does? And by looking at this study, which was done by Standard & Poor's Capital some years ago, you can see that the costs, the SG&A is the sales, general and administrative costs. For a retailer, they're not insignificant, typically somewhere around the 20% level. So in terms of the overall cost base of an organization, the costs of non-production labor, advertising, rent, and of course, if we automate, then rent becomes potentially less significant because we have fewer people sitting in offices. Things like executive salaries and then just general support, many of those activities being office-based, administrative functions, those are pretty significant costs to an organization. Now, you're probably sitting there thinking, well, my business is, my administrative processes, actually, they are, to some extent, they're already automated. And that is the fact. In fact, about in the mid-90s, there was a move towards using enterprise resource planning systems, or ERP. And those systems are essentially information in through forms. They goes into a database. At their core, the ERP system is a database system. And the output, where people can make decisions, are read from the screen or from paper in the form of reports. So the ERP system integrates the business functions: sales, purchasing, HR, procurement, finance, manufacturing, etc. And they, to a degree, they enable automated data processing. And it's the intention that everything that a business does is managed within its ERP system, or the data handling and the decision-making data is handled within the ERP system. Those of you that have been involved with ERP implementations, or those of you that have gone through the thinking process, shall I move from a mixture of different systems onto an ERP system, will be aware that the process of switching between systems can be painful. First of all, the ERP system has a certain workflow logic that may require people in the business to re-engineer their processes. And that means people have to change the way that they work, or alternatively, the ERP is adapted so that it exactly matches the current way of working. But if that's the case, some of the benefits of the ERP system may be lost. And certainly in terms of the cutover to an ERP system, there can be quite a lot of business disruption. You have to load data from old systems into new systems, and so on. So implementing an ERP is not a straightforward process. And then the other point around ERP systems where we say, well, why then have we still got spreadsheets? Why have we still got people using their mouse and their keyboard so intensively when we have these ERP systems? Is that ERP systems typically, to the extent that they are implemented, focus on the core activities of the organization. So if you think about it in terms of a road network system, the motorway, the freeway perfectly caters for the big journeys that people are undertaking. But once you come off the motorway, you've got little villages, you've got little industrial estates, and in each one of those, things are done a little bit differently. So it's much more difficult to set up standardized routines that are going to perfectly fit every non-core activity. So as a result of that, what do we see in our organizations? Well, in terms of data sources, people working in administrative functions, they're probably receiving some information by email. They probably have some web applications and their ERP, and they're having to collate to be able to give management information to their organization. They're having to collate from different sources of data before that they can report out to allow decision makers to steer the business. So that means a lot of manual processing, and that whenever we do things manually, there's always a risk that something goes not the way it was intended. And if something doesn't go the way we wanted, we spot it through a quality control process. We say, well, if Department X is reporting the information in this way, and Department Y, it's a little bit different. So that's the quality control. And then, okay, we have to investigate why is that different. So we then have rework, checking it out, making a change. And that can result in delayed outputs. So our decision makers are waiting a few hours longer or a few days longer to get accurate reporting. And as a result of that, yeah, it's resource intensive, and there can be costs. We saw that in the SG&A costs. That's what drives the SG&A costs to be higher, the sales, general, and administrative costs. So going back basically to the beginning of of the 2000s, there was an evolution of platforms coming onto the market, which were first termed by the Blue Prism company as RPA, or Robotic Process Automation. And RPA systems enable the automation of data transfer and the preparation of reporting using mainly the user interface. So what an RPA system does is to take over, or if you watch a desktop machine that is running RPA software, you can see the clicks going on, you can see forms being filled out, but there's nobody sitting at the computer. So it's using the user interface in order to accomplish a computerized task. So we see Blue Prism came in, Automation Anywhere, based in the US, and then UiPath and Pega in the 2005. More lately, WorkFusion joined the market, and last year, Microsoft launched a little bit different system, but essentially an RPA system called Power Automate, enabling organizations to automate their processes. So there's plenty of choice. There are plenty of providers available for RPA. So now what I'm going to do is to talk a little deeper about what RPA does and also what it does not do. Okay, so the beauty of RPA is that it enables non-IT people to drag activities onto a workflow, and they activities, once triggered, or a series of activities in the workflow area, once triggered, they will automatically run. So it might be getting information from a spreadsheet. It might then, the new activity, which will be type into, will type that information into a web form. And then the last activity might be click the button to send the send the information into the database. So that is how RPA systems work. And you can even record activities and it will replay the activities. The reality, though, is that technically, the skills that an RPA developer requires are quite technical. I pulled this from a job that was advertised last week, and you can see here, this was for an RPA developer job advertised last week. The person who would apply for this job needs to have experience of developing and testing software, adhering to structured and document methodology, which is not something that most business analysts, let's say, would have got that experience. They should be a certified developer. Again, that means it's rather a specialized activity. And even more specialized, they should have experience in object-oriented programming. So that's really getting into quite hardcore programming knowledge for somebody to be able to be an RPA developer. They should have software development experience. And even this job obviously was requiring somebody to work on the Blue Prism platform, so they should have a Blue Prism professional certification. So far from being something that any business analyst can use to automate their own system, there are specialized skills required. And my realization as I got deeper into working with RPA and then finding, well, there are some things that aren't quite working for me, so let me go and hunt for a new way of work, or for something that can complement my RPA routines, was that actually the way that RPA sequences work is very similar to programming that has been in place for many years. So if I demonstrate that an RPA system or sequence, you have to work with variables in most cases to make the sequence work. So we're going to say we've got a variable X, and that we're going to assign it a value of 5. And we're going to have a variable Y, and we're going to give that the value 3. And then we're going to say that Z is X plus Y. So those are boxes in RPA that you'll drag into the workflow to set up your variables. If you look at the PHP language, which is used in web application development, it works pretty much exactly the same way. You assign an X value, which is 5. You assign a Y value, which is 3. You use a different nomenclature, but you're doing exactly the same thing. And then you're saying that my Z variable is going to be X plus Y. So if you can look at those two sequences, the one is a workflow, a GUI-based workflow. The other uses code, but essentially they do the same thing. And the logic that somebody has to go through when they're learning RPA is pretty much the same as the logic that they would go through if they chose to take a different route and to use a regular programming language such as PHP. The other thing that my other realization when I automated my reverse auction system was that one of the challenges with RPA is that because RPA is using the user interface to be able to take information or post information into a web form, for instance, is that the user interface actually loads at a different speed. Now, as a human, we don't really see that as a challenge, because if it's a half a second or it's 1.5 seconds, it doesn't make too much of a difference. But in terms of RPA, you have to take countermeasures because the user interface is sometimes not loading on time. And also the developer, the owner of the user interface, the software owner, may choose to update their user interface so that the button is in a different place. And all of these things can lead to performance issues. Now, the RPA software does have remedial activities that you can bring in. There's something called a try-catch activity that is designed to say, well, if there's a failure, then we're going to do something else. But those failures are happening because we're working at the user interface level. So initially, I was a big fan of RPA. It helped me to do some things automatically that previously I would have had to do manually. But is RPA therefore really going to be the driver of the changes that people talk about with robots potentially taking over 20 million jobs in the US by 2030? Is that, now as we get to the crux of the question, is that hype or is that reality? I am still a great believer in automation, and this is why. 2 points. The first one is we have seen in the last years the rise of a large number of web applications that are, let's say, best in class, niche web applications. And those web applications provide what is called an application program interface, an API, which allows somebody who wants to get the benefits of whatever that niche activity does to mash up that activity with the activity of the outputs, inputs, outputs of some other web applications to achieve some kind of goal. So let me give you an example. Take a hospital scheduling process. So this is the process where a doctor would have treated a patient. There needs to be a follow-up treatment, and at its worst, right now, that will be a manual process. The doctor will provide some inputs to somebody whose job is a hospital scheduling specialist, and they will then pivot between different systems, updating the health records, and then for the new appointments, looking at the staff roster, and then making sure that the room is available and the relevant equipment is going to be in the right place at the right time. So manually, that process will involve a specialist pivoting between the different systems using the trusty mouse and keyboard. In the world of APIs, you can have the situation where we have a specialized electronic health record web application, we have a staff rostering web application, and we have a facility and equipment scheduling web application. And if each of those are then have the capability of inputs and outputs via an API, here's how the process can work. So our doctor inputs the data through a mobile device to give their treatment notes and the fact that there's a need for a follow-up treatment. A script that the health organization itself would develop then will take that information and it will pass the information on to the electronic health records system to be able to input the notes and follow-up activities that the doctor has required. The application will then look into the staff rostering web application to find out which staff are available on which days. And finally, next step, it's going to check with the facility and equipment scheduling web application to see the rooms and relevant equipment that's available. So the script and all of that is enabled because there are APIs between each of those web applications that can talk to the script of the health organization. The application will then crunch through the variables in terms of staff rostering equipment, and ultimately will book the treatment, place bookings of the equipment and staff into the systems, and lastly then issue confirmation to the doctor and to the patient of what the scheduling has set out. So you can see from that process, it did not involve robotic process automation, which would take the existing systems that are manually used manually today. What it will do instead is to, via APIs, handle all of the information requirements, and that can happen in a matter of seconds with the electronic communications between the different systems. Another example in terms of business reporting, a lot of RPA is used to automate the reporting that an analyst might be going through, of receiving information from different systems, putting that into a spreadsheet, updating it, issuing a report to business decision makers. Today, there are systems, to name two of them, Power BI and Tableau, that have API access, and they can then talk to different business systems. Might be your manufacturing system, might be your finance database. And so once a business report is established on the BI platform, Power BI or Tableau, all that happens each month then is to refresh the data, which will happen automatically in the background, and that becomes an automated activity. So that's the first factor that I see has changed in the automation world in the last few years, is the widespread availability of APIs. The next one is the development of so-called artificial intelligence. And what sits behind artificial intelligence is the ability for computers to make judgments. So if we have historic data with a recruitment process, which compares aptitude tests that have been given to recruits with the historic performance of people that joined the company, we can then build a model, we can build a kind of an equation that says performance has the following relationship with the results of the aptitude test. And that means that the machine, if you like, can forecast once a candidate has done the aptitude test, how well they are going to perform. So that's a very simple version of a computer model that can make a judgment. And so the AI is based on computer models. Until recently, computers have been very bad at understanding natural language. And because of these computer models, they are now becoming extremely good at it. So you take a situation with some kind of customer satisfaction analysis. We probably getting in our database, we've got a database that's full of comments from customers. So this customer says, I've been home waiting all day for your technician to fix my washing machine. Technician is 5 hours late. I'm completely fed up with your company. I'll never buy a product from your company again. Thank you for nothing. Now, a computer has to be, well, until recently, has had to have rules set up. And so the rule might be, well, if the text contains thank you, then we'll set the customer satisfaction score to 100. And it's very, very difficult for a programmer to work through and say, well, you could, of course, have a rule that says if it says thank you, but it also has fed up in the text, that's not going to be a score of 100. But for a programmer to think through all of the permutations that tells you that a thank you is not a good statement is very difficult. But because we now have computer models that have crunched through many, many historic records of text, and we know whether those were positive or negative, we're now in the position where machines can automatically do activities that until very recently we would have said are the domain of human beings. So the Microsoft offer a system that you can train based on your historic frequently asked questions and websites, product manuals, and so on. And with that training, the digitization of the statements that are in all of the text that you've got on record, we're now able to build computer models that will enable human questions to be accurately answered by a computer, by an artificial intelligence. So Yeah, I remain a great believer in the prospects for automation, for the fact I believe our jobs are going to become significantly more interesting in the next years. But if you decide, yes, automation is for me, I believe there are three key questions that we need to ask ourselves. The first one is, do we have significant knowledge of relevant APIs and AI and how they can enhance our processes? So it's very difficult when we don't know of the existence of a facility to imagine a world that is incorporating that facility. If you think about somebody 100 years ago that was recruiting a farm laborer, it might not have been immediately obvious that they would need mechanical skills to fix a tractor, because until that point, the horse was the most important, one of the most important tools on the farm. The next question is, does automation offer my organization a competitive advantage? Is it worth it? What's in it for me? So obviously we can think about cost reduction. But beyond that, I think you can also think about the speed and quality of strategic insights. So the faster we get our reporting to decision makers, the faster the decision makers can react and maybe start a new promotion in a retail environment. So time is of the essence. We might also find that we have improved customer service. So if you consider that Microsoft facility, the AI can respond immediately to questions, whereas I think we've all had the experience of hanging on the telephone waiting for your turn to come in the queue. And beyond that, an organization can also potentially offer a wider range of services. So services which might not have been economic when you need a human to support that activity might well become economic with an automated service. And so an organization can offer a wider range of services. And then lastly, does our organization have the skills required to implement an automation? So do we need to bring those skills in? Do we have them already? Do we have people with the basic requirements of an understanding of processes that we can train to get those skills? Okay. So once you've gone through that process about is automation something that's good for our organization, and do we have the skills to be able to make it happen? The next question is, well, which processes do I want to automate? And there are three areas to look at there. The first one is, how suitable are the processes? The next one is, what value will the automation of the process bring? And then the third one is, what risk am I running by automating the process? So in terms of suitability, the factors you need to look at are the volume of transactions, the process maturity. So if a process is mature, it's probably more stable, and therefore, and we know how it works repeatedly, and therefore it's in a better state for automation. Also, if the process has an existing degree of digitization, meaning, for instance, that it's not relying on PDF inputs, we might already have digital data that can automatically be tied into an automated system, that puts it in a better, as a higher priority for digitization or for automating the process. And then lastly, on the suitability is the availability of APIs and AI systems which are compatible with that process. If there are APIs and AI systems compatible with the process, obviously that's a good candidate. That process is a good candidate for automation. The next one, in terms of value, linked to the volume of transactions, the labor intensity. So do I currently have quite a lot of team members who are involved in that process, and is the process repetitive, which makes it much quicker to develop an automated system? And the other one is, will I enhance value to the customer by automating the process? So labor intensity, repetitiveness, and value to customer will contribute to the value of automating the process. And the last one then is risk. What risk am I running by automating this process? So the first thing you might want to look at is, well, if something goes wrong with the process, do I run the risk of not complying with some regulatory requirements? So, if the robot stops for a month and I've not monitored it, the fact that that stopped, maybe I'm not collecting key data that I'm required to under the regulations that govern my industry. Next one then is, again, if the process fails, is my customer going to experience that? So if my automated process is something to do with ordering food for my in-house canteen, maybe I'm not too worried. If something goes wrong, we can always manually go and order that product. But if my customer does experience a failure, then that's a process I might want to leave until I've reached a level of maturity in automating processes. And all of that is really underpinned by the stability of the system. If there's very low risk that the system will fall over, then I might not need to worry about some of the other downsides. In terms of stability and system failure, the question comes up, why is that such an issue? And it's particularly an issue with graphical user interface, GUI-based robots. So a robot will break if the user interface changes and the robot needs to click or type into a particular part of a page, and the owner of the system that you're trying to type into has made a change to the system so the robot can't find what it's looking for. There are ways to overcome that, but that is a reason why robots can break. And the other one I mentioned earlier is that the screen latency, the speed of presentation of the screen to the robot can vary. And if it goes too long, that can cause the robot to fail. So ways to deal with that, we can build better robots. Our developers need to anticipate the ways that robots might break. And we need to train the developers to design the robots to have resiliency to overcome those risks. And the other one then is to plan for when automation does break. Critical is to monitor performance so that if the robot breaks, we know it immediately. And we should have some kind of model and a team who are ready to jump into action if there is a failure of the automated robotic system. And you can do that in-house, or you can also rely on third-party organizations that have evolved in the last years to provide robotic support services. Next topic I want to look at is security. So in order to cut the maintenance that's associated with a robotic administrative system, or RPA, the developer might choose not to change the credentials that are required in order to log into the system, because every time the credentials change, there's a risk of failure. And the other thing is that robots are given very often high-level access, meaning that they have access to a wide range of functionality within a given system. And that is done because if you need to segregate all of your robots into having different access, you run the risk of failure if you get it wrong. And it requires a lot more thinking when you are designing or creating the architecture behind the automated process. And anytime you've got credentials which are not changed often, you run the risk that once a hacker has attempted to cycle through a whole range of alternative passwords, they're able to get into the robot itself and therefore into the application. And given that the application of the robot has wide access to the functionality, maybe even administrative functionality on the application, then we run the risk that the hacker via the robot is able to completely take over the system that the robot is working on. Web applications, they are not going to be 100% secure, just straight out of the bag, but they certainly do have facilities which overcome some of the issues involved, particularly with hard coding credentials into a robot. So yeah, security is still a real issue with web applications, but it's at a higher level than it would be if credentials are hard-coded into a robot. So just a couple of slides in conclusion. How will automation affect my organization? So if my glass is half empty, I would probably say, you know, here are the downsides. We're going to see fewer colleagues in offices, which might mean there's less creativity, fewer water cooler moments where people get together and think of new solutions. And particularly for, you know, people just starting out on their careers, some of those repetitive jobs are really good activities for joining an organization, getting a feel for how the organization works before progressing through your career. From a customer side, you might enjoy, even though you have to wait 30 seconds to connect with a human, you might have less personal support. And yeah, process failures are a risk with automated systems. And so you could see reduced service if there is an outage of the automated process. And potentially we would see a reduction in information security. That said, you know, if your glass is half full, you would be expecting to see reduced administrative costs. You should see your activities running faster, meaning that decision makers get instant information. And ultimately, we might move some of even the decision making into an AI environment. So really fast decision making, really dynamic changes of direction within an organization. Machines, once they're set up correctly, will just repeat the process the same way every time. So we should see increased accuracy in processing. And as a result of that, you'll then see more reliable process output. I can trust the output. I don't have to go and compare Department X output with Department Y to make sure it really works in the same way as I might do with a manual process. If you can get through the issue of jobs for people who are just new and joining an organization, we should start to see jobs being much more interesting, much more focused on where a human really works better than a machine in terms of, you know, working in an organization face to face with customers. And the ability, as I mentioned earlier, to offer services which might not have been economic before. So that's my conclusion, just to sum up, is I'm a great believer in automation. I believe we have real prospects ahead of us, but my focus would be on working with systems that make use of program interfaces rather than working with the user interface, and increasingly using artificial intelligence. I'd like to pass it over to you and get your thoughts. I don't know if there are any questions. Okay. So here's a question that has come in. I'll just read through. So the question, given you seem a little bit cynical about robotic process automation, do those systems have any value? Well, that's a good question, and I wouldn't say cynicism. It's more choosing the right tool for the right place. So there is a place for robotic process automation. If your organization is working with mainframe systems, or you're working with systems that have no API available, then RPA is a good solution for you. And certainly, I will always be in favor of RPA over and above manually working with manually processing information. Okay, let's see. Related to that one, then the question is, why is RPA being adopted by so many companies? Well, firstly, I'd refer back to what I previously said. If you are working with systems that don't have APIs available, then it's really the only option you have available. But I do think there is a need to raise awareness of the systems that are available with APIs to support your organization and your processes. Oh, and that brings me on to the next question, which is how can I get better awareness of APIs which can help my business? I think if I was in an organization, if I was back in a finance organization or procurement organization, the first thing I would do would be to talk to my existing system providers and ask them which APIs do they have available. And I'd probably talk also to their competitors to see which automated functionality via APIs that they are offering. And that will help to help me to inform myself and say, okay, now I've got a better view on what can be automated. There's also a website which is called Programmable Web. So it's programmableweb.com. And that actually is dedicated to making the world aware of systems that have API availability. And last time I looked, I think they have something like 20,000 APIs, and that's growing, or they have a description of about 20,000 APIs that are available. And then what I also say, NobleProg has a fantastic network of experts in this area and many other technical areas. So I think NobleProg would be a great resource to increase awareness. The next question is, you mentioned that access to the right skills is important. How would you address that? I think the first point there is you can recruit the people with the right skills, but you can also of course, train your existing people. So I think that managers who are proposing training for their organization need to think beyond the obvious. So this year we're going to send everybody on Excel training, for instance. I would be challenging that, and I would be saying, maybe you should be raising the awareness of your managers so that they can understand the benefit of the teams being able to work with systems like Python or R, and sending the teams on training courses on alternative languages, and not to be concerned that coding is something that's too difficult. With the right training, you'll find that it is not, and you significantly increase your opportunities for automating your processes.
Lovely. Is that all of our questions, do we think now?
Yeah, there's one. Oh, actually, the one that I've still got is actually a replication of one I answered earlier. So that's it. Okay.
Lovely. Well, thank you, Richard. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you for your time and for sharing your expertise with us. I think it was a great insight into RPA and what the future may hold. And I'd like to say thank you to everybody for attending the webinar today, and I hope you've enjoyed the session. We will be posting the recording online probably later today, so if you'd like to listen to it again, it will be available. And as Richard mentioned, we have got lots of courses on this topic and many others, so if any of our courses are of interest to you, please do get in touch, and one of the team will be happy to help you. And yeah, we hope you can join us next time for our next Cup of Tech, and details will be released for that one very soon. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.